All right, it's Thursday, July the 9th, the year 2020. We are continuing in part 4 of They Got Their Man by Elmer Lynn Williams, a story of income tax persecution. Last time we got to the bottom of page 61, so we're going to pick up with the top of page 62. There is a facsimile of a letter, and I'll read you the letterhead. Carl J. Merrill, Edward J. Lawler, Jr., Washington, James R. Murphy. That's on the left, and then in big bold at the middle at the top is George K. Bowden, attorney at law, 105 West Adams Street, Chicago, Franklin, 4824 or 4624, it's hard to read. Washington Southern Building, National, 3080 or 3060. Anyway, July the 6th, 1937, Mr. W.H. Malone, I testified in your trial concerning an understanding I had with the penal section of the General Counsel's Office, Bureau of Internal Revenue, concerning a hearing to be accorded you prior to possible criminal action. My testimony was complete on the matter and correct. You have requested me, however, to restate the understanding that I had. Briefly, in December 1932, I conferred with Mr. Boyd of the Penal Division, to whom your case had been assigned. I requested that the matter be not transferred to the Department of Justice for possible criminal action until you had been accorded a hearing before Mr. Boyd or in the penal section. Mr. Boyd assured me that the matter of your possible indictment for tax evasion would not be submitted to the department or to the district attorney at Chicago until you had been accorded an opportunity for hearing. Sincerely yours, George K. Bowden. Nearly 9 years have passed since the government made that promise to Mr. Bowden, Mr. Malone's then attorney, but that promise was not kept, and Malone has not yet had a hearing before the Board of Tax Appeals. Chapter 6. The Broken Pledge. In filing his report for the year 1930, Mr. Malone attached a rider which read, Park Ridge, Illinois, September the 12th, 1931. Collector of Internal Revenue, Chicago, Illinois. Sir, enclosed herewith is my personal income tax return for the year 1930. My personal income tax returns for the years 1926 to 1929 inclusive are now under audit by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. The completion of this examination may necessitate the making of adjustments in this return. Respectfully signed, William H. Malone. The above letter of explanation attached to his 1930 return was deemed necessary because government agents claimed he had a larger taxable income than his returns indicated. Malone contested their claim and asked for a hearing before the Board of Tax Appeals, which he never obtained. In 2 separate interviews with Washington authorities, he was assured there was nothing criminal in his case. His indictment followed these assurances without ever having a civil hearing. The revenue agents at the time of the trial frankly admitted that Malone's books and records, to which they had free access, had been kept by a competent and honest bookkeeper, and that the auditor who had made out the income tax return was likewise both honest and competent. It is significant that the auditor, Condon H. Ronan, employed by Malone, was at the time of the trial and is now working for the government. During the trial, government agents tried to prevent Roman from being a witness for Malone. However, he was determined to defend the work he had done and took a leave of absence to testify and defend the income tax report he had prepared. In answer to the questions of the revenue agents as to the source of large deposits that he had made, and as shown by his reports for certain years, Malone said that these funds consisted of monies held by him that were not subject to income tax. These deposits had been openly made in a national bank in his own name. There was no concealment. He knew that the fact of having his money through the years following 1920 could be corroborated by his secretary, his close associates, and others who had personal knowledge of it. And as a last resort, rather than pay an unjust tax, he would tell of the pledge exacted by Colonel Proctor and all the circumstances connected with the political donation. He filed objections with the U.S. Board of Tax Appeals, which is composed of men's selected because of their ability to pass upon the intricate problems of taxation. They are familiar with the law which exempts political contributions from income tax payments. Malone leaves for Germany. While his objections were on file, Malone informed the Board of Tax Appeals that it was necessary for him to go to Germany on urgent business, and for that reason pressed for an early hearing of his case. He was told there were thousands of cases ahead of his, that he would have to wait, but he was assured no action would be taken during his absence. With that understanding, accompanied by his wife, he left for Germany late in December of 1932 to institute legal proceedings against Paul and Martin Polka, two former residents of Illinois who are now citizens of Germany. These two men owed him almost $100,000 and had given him their note. The prospect of obtaining much-needed ready cash to meet interest requirements and other obligations spurred him on to enforce collection. The following March, while in Germany, Malone learned that all the banks in the USA, because of the shrunken value of their securities, had been closed by order of the president. He immediately returned home to assist in reopening the Citizens State Bank in Park Ridge, of which he was president. Although not legally required to do so, Malone stripped himself of property and cash in order to reopen the bank. It was through his sacrifice that every dollar of the depositors' money was saved. Malone again leaves for Germany. When the bank was reopened, he turned his attention to the business in Germany. He again went to Washington, accompanied by his attorney, who again asked the department head whether there would be any action in the case during his absence. Malone was told emphatically once more that no action would be taken because there was no criminal element involved in his case. Relying upon that pledge, he and his wife, for the second time, embarked for Germany to try to collect the money due him. A few months later, contrary to the assurances he had received, Malone was indicted in Chicago on a charge of having willfully evaded the payment of income taxes for 2 years, 1929 and 1930. When the news reached Malone, his immediate impulse was to return home and press for trial at once. His attorney in Germany, Frederick Wirth, president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Berlin, who had been engaged upon the recommendation of the American consul there, warned Malone that under the Nazi law, if he, a non-resident, should leave Germany after beginning a lawsuit and remain away even a short time, he could not reinstate his legal proceedings. The case was long drawn out. The final judgment provided for payments to be made in marks and in installments covering a period of years, and none of the money was to be taken out of Germany. The ruling of the Nazi courts blocking the marks and providing payment over a period of years froze almost $100,000 admittedly owed to him by the Polka brothers. Malone had hoped that this money could be used toward saving his many valuable real estate holdings, including the beautiful Pickwick building in Park Ridge. However, the ruling of the Nazi courts made this impossible. His property, sacrificed under foreclosures during his absence, could not be redeemed. With his last dollar tied up in Germany, he sailed for home and announced he was ready for trial. Malone had barely reached home when he was besieged by those who claimed to have contacts with the right people. He was told that for a consideration, the indictment would be quashed. They would not believe that a man who had been considered wealthy a few years before could have lost it all. They were persistent in their efforts to convince him that he should avoid a trial at all hazards. Nevertheless, Malone had absolute faith that a fair trial by jury would mean his vindication. Ha, ha, ha. Okay, page 67, chapter 7, grand jury abuses. At present, a few individuals can select and thus practically pack a grand jury in Chicago so that a few men have in their power to shield some offenders and also use a grand jury to carry out partisan schemes. Consequently, the grand juries of Cook County have been used repeatedly in recent years to influence public sentiment with reference to a prospective election by indicting upwards of 100 men on sensational charges. And when the elections were over and the public had lost interest in the matter, the cases were all thrown out of court. This method of prostituting the machinery of the court should be stopped, and the law should be so changed that it will not be in the power of a few men to name or control a grand jury. From an official message to the state legislature by former Governor John P. Altgeld of Illinois. As late as December 1940, William Scott Stewart, who has an outstanding reputation as a defense attorney in criminal cases, in speaking before the Illinois State Attorneys Association convention at the Morrison Hotel, denounced these abuses as follows. The federal courts draw jurors from miles away from the scene of the trial. Usually, local officials are asked to supply names of prospective jurors. The officials suggest the names of relatives who favor the government's case to help the official hold his job. A federal indictment is as good as a conviction. The coercion of witnesses in the Malone case offers further evidence of grand jury abuses. Attorney Henry L. Blim was one of the witnesses before the grand jury. He had for many years been employed by Mr. Malone in his private business. After leaving Malone's employ, Blim was engaged by the law firm of Huff and Cook with the evident belief that because of old friendship, he could persuade Malone to reduce the valuation of the capital stock of the Chicago Street car lines, which the law firm represented. Here again, the records show Malone refused to make any reduction. The Chicago Street car lines were sued by the county in 1927 for taxes amounting to $2,192,145.40. Huff, Cook, and Blim were the attorneys. The case was presented in the circuit court by the state attorney, who agreed to $1,010,597.79 cut from the taxes due, thus setting aside the assessment which had been confirmed by Malone as chairman of the State Tax Commission. This reduction, ordered by the judge in the circuit court without notice to Malone, was over 46% of the taxes. For his services in this court action, attorney Henry L. Blim received a check for $12,500. The government sought to compel Blim to testify before the grand jury that he had given part of that fee to Malone. Blim emphatically denied paying Malone anything. On his refusal to commit perjury, by saying he had given money to Malone, he was taken before federal judge John P. Barnes, who ordered him to return to the grand jury and change his story. When Blim refused for the second time, he was again taken before the same judge, who sentenced him to jail for 3 months for contempt of court. Neither the threats of a federal judge nor a sentence to jail could force him to bear false witness that would... Okay, at the top of page 69 is a black and white photograph of Henry L. Blim, and underneath it says, Attorney Blim was held in contempt of court and sentenced to jail by federal Judge Barnes because he had refused to testify that he had given part of the fee he had received from Chicago traction lines to Malone. Blim declared that if he were to testify, he would be committing perjury. Therefore, he appealed from the sentence of Judge Barnes to the United States Court of Appeals, where his case was reviewed, and Blim completely exonerated. So we're going to go back to the bottom of page 68. Neither the threats of a federal judge nor a sentence to jail could force him to bear false witness that would, top of page 70, send an innocent man to jail and cause his ruin. Blim appealed to the United States Circuit Court of Appeals, number 5083. That court exonerated him. In setting aside his sentence, the court said, from this recital of facts, it will appear that Blim told his story at least 4 times. If it was false in any part, it could have been readily checked up and the fact brought to the attention of the grand jury and the court. Its decision laid emphasis on Blim's answer to the question as to whether he gave $7,500 to William H. Malone. Said Attorney Blim, "No, sir, I did not, because Malone did not help us on that matter. He would not be entitled to a thing. We had to go to court that year and undo what damage they did to us in the tax commission." The court further commented on Blim's testimony and said, "It seems that, notwithstanding all the positive facts of which appellant Blim testified, including names and addresses of the concerns and persons with whom he did business and about purchasing materials, furnishing, and work in remodeling his home, there was no witness brought before the grand jury or presented in court to show that any statements made by the appellant Blim was false. The case referred to had been tried before Judge Arnold in a court of record, and if Blim's statement were untrue, that could readily have been shown. Had Blim been able to influence Malone, that influence would have been used to obtain the assessment favorable to the traction lines. Malone had the power to grant what the corporation sought, and the records furnish definite proof that he acted without fear or favor, regardless of the pleas of his friends. hence the appeal to the Circuit Court of Cook County where the favorable rulings were obtained. I went down into the vaults of the county building and found the records which definitely confirm Blim's statements. The cases referred to by him were discussed with others in a succeeding chapter. The experiences of two other witnesses, John W. Ellis and Frank L. Tuttle, before the grand jury are described in reviewing their testimony given at the Malone trial and their beliefs filed in the disbarment proceedings against them. Okay, top of page 72, chapter 8, the indictment. Malone was defeated for governor in 1932, and in that election, his political enemies gained control of every jurisdiction of government. What better way could they now find to remove and destroy the most troublesome barrier blocking their path to power and pelf, P-E-L-F, than to revive an old charge that Malone himself was a tax dodger? The same charge had been made years before by agents of the corporations Malone had exposed and his political enemies, who at that time, however, lacked the power to prosecute and crucify. But now their power was boundless, so they set in motion the machine which they knew would accomplish their purpose. Malone was indicted on charges of having willfully evaded income taxes for the years 1929 and 1930. The indictment was returned in 1933 after he had gone to Germany for the second time. When Malone was able to perfect his judgment for the money owed to him, he returned home from Germany and demanded trial. The case had been assigned to Judge John P. Barnes. Malone's attorney demanded a change of venue. When asking for the change, he cited the fact that Judge Barnes had tried to force attorney Henry Blim to testify falsely before the grand jury, which indicted Malone and actually sentenced Blim to jail for refusing to do so. He declared that Judge Barnes, by that action, demonstrated his prejudice, and therefore Malone would not receive a fair trial before him. Having declared that he could not have a fair trial either before Judge Barnes or Judge Wilkerson, his case was transferred to Judge Hawley for trial. But strange as it may seem, the most important question in Malone's case, i.e. whether or not he had been legally indicted, was not decided by Judge Hawley, but by Judge Wilkerson. Wilkerson was a close personal friend of Governor Loudon, who appointed Wilkerson chairman of the Illinois Commerce Commission, in which capacity he served until appointed to the federal bench. Wilkerson had handled utility litigation, including the Chicago streetcar lines, and had long been affiliated with Malone's political enemies. He was brought into the trial by an unusual piece of legerdemain, which has puzzled lawyers who have examined the record. The plea to quash the indictment. Malone's attorney had filed with the trial judge, Hawley, a motion to quash the indictment, raising the point of law that Junior Judge Barnes had exceeded his statutory authority in impaneling and extending the term of the grand jury which indicted Malone. The senior judge, Wilkerson, was sitting at that time, and under the U.S. law, no other judge was authorized to impanel or extend the term of a grand jury. An identical plea had been heard by Judge Hawley just a short time before in the case of United States versus Corcoran. Corcoran, among others, was indicted for using the mails to defraud, resulting in a loss to investors of around $30 million. Hawley quashed the indictment against Corcoran because a judge other than the senior judge, as provided by the statute, had impaneled the grand jury that voted the indictment. He held that a jury so impaneled had no legal status and its indictments were void, so Corcoran was set free. The Malone motion filed with Judge Hawley set forth the same facts as prevailed in the Corcoran case. And then on the next page is looks like a drawing of a lady with a cape on, and she has a crown on her head that's got emboldened across the crown, justice. And then there's a snake at her feet, and written on the snake is perjury. It looks like some sort of political cartoon. So let's go back to the text. The jury that indicted Malone had not been impaneled by the senior judge as the law definitely provided. Judge Hawley could not reverse himself without losing face. If he were to make the same ruling in the Malone case as did in the Corcoran case, Malone would be a free man also. Hawley was indeed in a dilemma. Hence, to escape such with a semblance of probity and at the same time hold Malone, he referred Malone's plea to Judge Wilkerson. In order to help Hawley hold Malone, Wilkerson ruled contrary to Judge Hawley's decision in the Corcoran case, denied Malone's plea, and then sent the case back to Hawley for trial. So we see at the very outset of Malone's trial a definite determination to indict and convict him regardless of the law. There were threats and intimidations used against the witnesses before the grand jury when the indictment was procured, and one witness was actually sentenced to jail because he refused to commit perjury, but was later exonerated by a higher court. Now, with the indictment an accomplished fact, we find the trial judge refusing to comply with the identical law, which he himself in a few weeks prior had definitely upheld. 3 months after Malone had been refused the protection which the application of the statute then in force would have given him, and which had been given to Corcoran, the Attorney General of the U.S. recommended and Congress passed an amendment to that law. Obviously, Malone's plea was sound at the time, else there would have been no reason to change the law. To clear up a doubt, here is the report of the Senate changing the law. And then on page 76, it appears to be some sort of report. And at the top, it says Department of Justice, Library, Calendar number 1309, Senate, 75th Congress, First Session, Report number 1258, Grand Jury Extensions. Mr. Ashurst from the Committee of the Judiciary submitted the following report to accompany H.R. 2702. The Committee on the Judiciary, to whom was referred the bill H.R. 2702, to permit grand jury extensions to be ordered by any district judge after consideration thereof, report the bill favorably to the Senate with the recommendation that it do pass. The committee adopts as its report the following statement from the House Report number 162, 75th Congress, First Session. The sole purpose of this bill is to clear up a doubt that has risen under existing law as to whether or not in districts where there is more than one district judge, a district judge other than the senior judge has power to extend the session of the grand jury to the term succeeding that for which it was summoned. The benefit of the doubt mentioned by Senator Ashurst had been given to Corcoran by Judge Hawley, but was denied to Malone. Despite the subtle shuffling of the pleadings, Malone believed that a faithful application of our laws would mean a fair trial and acquittal, but the injustice of the indictment and pleadings was surpassed by the infamy of the trial. On the top of page 77 is a photograph of a man in a suit. He's got white hair, got spectacles, sitting at a desk, and it says Judge William H. Hawley. Judge Hawley presided at the trial of William H. Malone and denied him the protection of a law he had previously upheld and then refused to grant him probation, as he had granted to bootleggers, dope peddlers, automobile thieves, counterfeiters, and other convicted criminals listed in part in this volume. Okay, the top of page 78. Chapter 9, the trial. A Roman holiday was anticipated when Malone was brought to trial. Inspired predictions appeared in the press concerning the number of witnesses who would testify against him. Over 100 persons, it was said, would tell of dealings with the chairman of the tax commission. When the trial opened, the assistant United States district attorney said, Now, gentlemen of the jury, the evidence will show that the defendant, William H. Malone, while he was chairman of the Illinois State Tax Commission during 1929 and 1930 on numerous occasions, used that office and the power which it gave him to collect from the attorneys representing those corporations before the Illinois State Tax Commission money in the form of currency in large bills to influence him in the assessment of the capital stock against those corporations. Although the indictment was for willful evasion of income taxes, tales of wholesale bribery were to be expected. Hints were published of startling and far-reaching revelations. The falsity of these statements was shown when only 3 persons were found to testify for the government as to Malone's income. The witnesses were John W. Ellis, Frank L. Tuttle, and Thomas D. Huff. They were attorneys for the Pullman Company and the Chicago Street Car Lines, the same corporations that Malone had fought for 20 years. Two of these attorneys testified that they placed currency in an envelope and gave it to a strange messenger whom they could not identify or even describe. They thought this stranger took the money to the chairman of the state tax commission or to someone collecting campaign funds. While their testimony was conflicting and vague, all three testified that their alleged donations were political contributions for campaign funds. Malone emphatically denied that the mythical messengers ever met him, and the commission's official records disclose that all three of these lawyers utterly failed to obtain favors from Malone for the corporations they represented. I was mightily impressed with the fact that the Pullman Company and the Chicago Traction Lines employed special attorneys to appear before the tax commission while Malone was chairman. The fact that these attorneys claimed close friendship to Malone no doubt led the corporations to believe that because of such friendship, they could accomplish that which their regular attorneys had failed to gain. In spite of the boasted friendship, however, the official records show that these special attorneys could not persuade Malone to change the assessments he had determined equitable. Thereupon, they circumvented Malone by going into a friendly court where they obtained the fulfillment of their schemes. Ellis, Tuttle, and Huff were the only witnesses the government produced in its vain effort to prove Malone had received taxable income upon which he had paid no tax. Their testimony did not support the opening statement of the assistant district attorney as to the alleged bribery, nor did it establish that which the prosecutor so desperately tried to prove. Furthermore, the government was thus bound by the testimony of its own witnesses that these payments, even if made, would have been political gifts and therefore not taxable as income. Malone, in order to refute this testimony, took the stand in his own behalf and told the story of how Colonel Proctor had made his political gift and that prior to his campaign for governor in 1932, he had at times taken monies from the Proctor Fund as against other money spent for political purposes. His testimony was corroborated by witnesses and by records from the Safety Vault Company showing that the times when he went to his safety box did coincide with his book records. We quote from the Internal Revenue Bulletin, which is printed and distributed by the Treasury Department, Bureau of Internal Revenue, United States Government. A political gift received by an individual or by a political organization is not taxable income to the recipient. Could any statement be more definite? Let me read that again. A political gift received by an individual or by a political organization is not taxable income to the recipient. This is quote from the Internal Revenue Bulletin, which is printed and distributed by the Treasury Department, Bureau of Internal Revenue, United States Government. Could any statement be more definite? Malone rightfully depended upon that plain rule which reference to the political gift he had received from Colonel Proctor in 1920. It is important to observe, as I have previously pointed out, that Malone was not holding public office at that time. All government witnesses, except three named, were used to trace deposits which Malone openly made in his own name in a national bank in which he was a director. The government agents frankly admitted Malone made no effort whatsoever to conceal his deposits. Not one witness was produced to prove Malone had received a single dollar of taxable income other than that which he had reported. I quote from an article written and published in 1938 by Mr. Guy Crapple, former assistant federal district attorney in Chicago. Mr. Crapple said, after 5 years of intensive investigation into the income of Malone on the part of the government, whose agents have access to all the books and records of over 20,000 corporations in Illinois, agents who knew of every item and of each and every check that those corporations issued and to whom and for what the money was paid. Notwithstanding that fact, the government only produced 3 corporation lawyers as witnesses against Malone, and their testimony was entirely irrelevant to the issue. Add to the further fact that Malone had incurred the enmity of those lawyers by his valiant fight against the very corporations they represented. I consider that fact a great compliment to Malone, who since 1912, with the exception of 3 years intervening 1917 to 1921, assessed all of the corporations in Illinois which came under the jurisdiction of the Board of Equalization and the State Tax Commission. Then add to that fact the very frank admission by the district attorney when he said that if Malone received the money from Colonel Proctor as he testified he did, then the government has no case against him. Combining all these facts convinces me that Malone is absolutely innocent of the charge upon which he has been found guilty. During the trial, I was gripped with a feeling that Malone was not required by law to report the political gift he received in 1920 from Colonel Proctor. I was deeply impressed with the fact he had attached a note to his 1931 income tax returning telling the government that his books were under audit for the purpose of settling dispute concerning previous years, that he had expressed his willingness to make an adjustment, even an adjustment in the event that either he or the government was mistaken. The act alone, I believe, removed any tenable charge of willful evasion. At least his tax became a controversial question subject to liberal interpretation. In no sense did the situation call for criminal prosecution. Particularly was this true when the citizen involved was a man of unquestioned integrity who had for a quarter of a century discharged the duties of great public and private trust with honor and distinction. However, because of the perjured testimony, false statements, and vicious personal abuse by the district attorneys before a bewildered jury, Malone was convicted, sentenced to a term of 2 years in the federal penitentiary, and fined $5,000. Emphatic proof that the testimony of these three corporation lawyers was false is to be found in the order of the Supreme Court of Illinois, which suspended all three government witnesses from the practice of law. The court, in its decision, said that the charges of obtaining tax reductions through the medium of campaign contributions is not established as evidence. The mountain labored and brought forth a mouse. One of the fishing expeditions to find evidence against Malone proved embarrassing to the district attorney. Just before the trial, much newspaper publicity was given to a story that government agents were hot in pursuit of A.A. Vidier, a Chicago lawyer who represented several utility kings. These agents said that Vidier had made large payments to Malone. A furor was caused when Vidier was located aboard the SS Queen Mary. According to press reports, he was about to flee to Europe. So forthwith, the government issued a subpoena in order to bring him to Chicago to appear as a witness. Vidier said he did not know Malone, and Malone, when interviewed by the press, declared he did not know Vidier. Vidier also said that he was merely on his way to London to view the ceremonies connected with the coronation of King George VI. However, he submitted a sworn statement to the government in which he carefully listed all money he had paid to public officials. Vidier's document contained a number of names, tabulating amounts and dates of payment. Malone's name was not on that list, but the name of the United States District Attorney Igo did appear for the tidy sum of $2,500. If that list had contained the name of Malone instead of Ego, then no doubt Ego would have argued that it was evidence of corruption. When his own name appeared and Malone's did not, the matter was immediately dropped. All right, we'll stop at the top of page 84, and we'll pick up on that page when we resume.